The report says there's less than 1% chance that the government's deficit to GDP plan unfolds as projected. For the average Canadian watching at home, does that mean that there's a 99% chance the government's plan does not unfold the way they say it will?
I think that that is a fair statement.
Mark Carney ignored OGO's official recommendation to appoint interim parliamentary budget officer Jason Jakes to the job permanently, instead choosing Annette Ryan. But after she testified at committee this week, Mark Carney may already be wondering whether his hand-picked PBO may actually be worse for him than the previous one. Let's take a look.
On May 29th, Statistics Canada revised its annual real GDP growth for 2025 upward from 1.7% to 1.9% for the entire year. In that release, StatsCan also reported that real GDP contracted at an annualized rate of 1% in the fourth quarter of 2025 and a further 0.1% in the first quarter of 2026. These revisions to GDP did not materially change the forecasts we presented in our economic and fiscal outlook on June 4th, which already anticipated below potential economic growth through 2026. In this way, parliamentarians should view our projections as reflecting continued below potential growth through 2026, broadly consistent with recent assessments by the Bank of Canada.
Okay, so this is the opening statement, or at least part of it, from Annette Ryan at the Government Operations and Estimates Committee, also known as the Mighty OGO, chaired by the one and only Kelly McCauley. Now, what she is saying here is that the forecast for Canada and the GDP is not very good for this year. She's saying it's essentially under potential, meaning our GDP is lower than we're actually capable of doing. This is an issue when Mark Carney is trying to say to Canadians, well, our economy is roaring back and it's amazing and it's awesome and we have a recession, which she smartly acknowledged in her own opening statement. So this is a very key point here, and this is the beginning of her whole testimony. And then she's going to move on to questions. And let me tell you, the Conservatives didn't waste any time.
The fact that the debt service costs are now, I mean, basically it's the second largest line item in the budget. You know, OAS costs are higher. It's more than we spend now on healthcare, and actually that gap is going to grow in the next couple of years. I think understanding sensitivity around what would happen if interest rates don't drop as we predict, or not as we predict, as the government predicts, what's that going to do to the fiscal framework? Because I think it will prevent some money being available for more productive uses, whether it's tax cuts or, of course, social programs. And I might just ask about the impact on the fiscal anchor, because I know that was also part of the work that you did. And did I read your work correct, that based on some of your assumptions, the government has about a 1% chance of keeping their new fiscal anchor?
That was very much part of our analysis in the fiscal outlook. So on your earlier points about the sensitivity, I agree, and we'll follow up on that. In terms of the analysis about the chance of the government meeting its fiscal anchor for a declining share of deficit to GDP, briefly what we did there was look back at the different types of shocks that have happened in the past and year-over-year shocks. And the result that the government, absent policy changes, would have roughly a 1% chance of meeting its deficit as GDP target rests on essentially the reality that both deficits and so the numerator as well as GDP itself are quite sensitive on a year-to-year basis. So given that that measure is defined as a decreasing track every year, that's what drives essentially that mathematical baseline, that it's going to be a very hard target to hit Not impossible, and especially if the government wants to manage it very carefully. But I think that is essentially the message that we want to put forward with that analysis.
Thank you. I understand that if they do break it, that would be the third fiscal anchor not kept in the last 3 or 4 years.
I haven't counted, but
Does that sound about right?
It sounds about right. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
All right, what is that about? So this is very, very significant. So the parliamentary budget officer, Mark Carney's hand-picked one. Remember, he disregarded Jason Jakes. Said, no, that guy's making us look too bad. We're going to take our pick. So the parliamentary budget officer is at committee testifying, saying that the government has about a 1% chance to actually hit their fiscal targets. And the justification for this is essentially, listen, unless they dramatically change their policy, which they're probably not going to do, the government is going to do what governments typically do, which is they say they're going to spend X, and then they spend X plus however many more billions of dollars. They always go over budget. Always. And a lot of that is just because of unpredictability, market factors, global factors, but also, especially when it comes to liberals, they cannot control themselves when it comes to spending other people's money. This is the issue. And then Chambers goes on to say, well, and this is going to be what, the third fiscal anchor? Because the Justin Trudeau liberals smashed through both of their fiscal anchors that they were tracking by. And the Carney government set up a brand new fiscal anchor, and it sounds like they're not even going to hit that one as well. And she said, yeah, basically, that sounds correct. So the fiscal prudent financial genius, Mark Carney, isn't even going to do anything different than Justin Trudeau. He invented his own fiscal anchor that isn't even recognized by many of the financial institutions around the country, and he's going to smash through that one, and he only has a 1% chance of not doing so. This is what Carney's hand-picked parliamentary budget officer is saying.
And I really want to zero in on one of the statements in the highlights, and it says the following: assuming no new measures are introduced and existing temporary measures sunset as scheduled, the budgetary deficit is projected to decline to $58.2 billion by 2030-31. And I want to ask for a little bit more of an explanation of that, but perhaps I'll ask my first question. Your report also showed that the debt to GDP ratio will be flat over the medium term. Is that based on the same assumption? That as long as there is no new funding introduced and old temporary spending sunsets?
That's correct, Ms. Block.
Okay, so is this a reasonable assumption? This is getting back to my first question around an explanation.
So I think it's difficult to portray all possible actions that a government might take. And so for that reason, we wanted to have a baseline that people could understand, okay, what's in, what's out, and, and from there, I think reasonable people can take their own perspectives about what the government may do moving forward in terms of things like renewal of the Canada Health Transfer, which, is currently on a track to move to a much lower growth for provinces and territories per current legislation. People may differ in terms of whether the government will move to take that back up to the traditional 5-6% range. That's not in our forecast. It's not in our medium-term track. And so we wanted to be clear and transparent so that as people kind of look at these type of measures moving forward, they can say, okay, that's not in, but we anticipate that that would be a reasonable thing to do. And if the government does that, you can do then calculations of, well, where does that take us in terms of debt to GDP and so on. So, so that was the underlying logic.
All right. So what this kind of boils down to and what this means is that in the report, what it says is, listen, assuming that the Liberals don't add any new spending and any of the temporary spending actually ends up being temporary and falls off the balance sheet, meaning it is temporary, and those programs or that spending stops like it's planned to, that is the only way that the interest charges may hold at around $58 billion by the early 2030s. That's what this boils down to. And Kelly Block says, well, is this a reasonable assumption? And what the PBO is essentially saying is, they said, listen, there's a lot of different factors here, so we had to kind of give some sort of benchmark where people can kind of zero in on so they understand where we are. And I think that's a reasonable approach, because it's hard for them to say, well, if they do this, and how much are they going to do it? And if they decrease spending, if they increase spending, they don't really know what the government is going to do. So they have to look at just a very easy metric that people can understand and kind of ground themselves to, which is if they don't add any other spending, and if they let all this temporary spending fall off, this is what this looks like. And that way, any changes up or down, you're measuring them against that benchmark, right? So, you know, if you think of this in terms of speed, so if you're traveling at 80 kilometers an hour and you're trying to get to a destination, the PBO will use that 80 kilometers an hour as the benchmark. Well, if you don't increase your speed, if you don't decrease your speed, you should get there within X amount of time. That's reasonable. But as we're going to find out, the government always speeds.
So, just for my own understanding, how many times in the last 10 years has the government not introduced new spending? Did you take that into consideration?
So very few, if not definitely zero. So I think, that question of how can we best support, a discussion of the fact that fiscal track has gone up year after year, budget after budget, it is very much the reality.
So she she acknowledged that, the government never doesn't introduce new spending because they can't help themselves. Look at what has happened, right? So Carney introduces his budget, and then he announces the Canadian Sovereign Wealth Fund, where they're going to put $25 billion of our money in there. That wasn't in the budget, folks. They cannot help themselves, and they cannot help themselves because when it comes to liberals, especially these new breeds of liberals, they don't respect that the money isn't theirs. If it was their money, this would be a very different story. But it's not. It's our money. And it's printed money, meaning it's the money of our children and great-grandchildren. So this is the admission by the parliamentary budget officer that, that benchmark that we set out, government is going to meet that at all. Meaning, going back to Mark Carney's brand new fiscal anchor that he invented that nobody else uses, he's not even going to meet the one that he set up for himself. Imagine that. You're sitting down with an opponent to play a board game. And the opponent has these rules. And you sit down and you say, no, I'm going to change the rules. I'm going to completely change the rules so I can win. And there's a lot of criticism from your opponent about that, but you say, too bad, I'm going to change the rules anyway. And you still lose. How can anyone take this guy seriously? The alleged banker, the alleged genius economist, the alleged negotiator. He has done nothing right. And the parliamentary budget officer right here is testifying that this is what the government's own figures show.
Moving on or pivoting slightly, we're certainly living in a period of considerable global uncertainty. Trade relationships, of course, are shifting. Geopolitical tensions remain elevated. And many advanced economies are facing fiscal pressures after years of responding to successive crises. Looking strictly at the fiscal indicators and the economic outlook, does Canada enter this period of global uncertainty from a position of relative strength compared to most advanced economies?
Ladies and gentlemen, Jenna Sutz, Liberal. What she's trying to do is put all of these qualifiers into her question to try to make the parliamentary budget officer give her a positive answer so that she can run out to the media and say, see, the parliamentary budget officer says that Canada is in a position of strength when it comes to the economy and relative to the other G7 nations. This is all the Liberal government is trying to do, is create talking points and marketing for their failed playbook. Now, I'm not going to play the whole answer. The initial part of the parliamentary budget officer's answer is interesting because she says, well, we have all these natural resources and, we have geolocation and all of this stuff. So there is some positives here. And then she says, that being said,
our business conditions have been concerning for quite a while. Our productivity numbers, our business investment, our research and development, our entrepreneurship numbers have been flat for quite a while, and that's translated into similarly lack of growth in GDP per capita over an extended time period that I think raise concerns as well.
You're looking for something positive to take away. You're trying to frame the question as positively as possible and box her in as much as possible. And what do you get? Well, the PBO says we have all the potential in the world. That's correct. But look at what has happened. Business growth has not been there. Research and development has not been there. Entrepreneurship has not been there. GDP per capita has not been there as a result. And this is reflected in the economy. So she's saying, this is concerning. And if I were to sum all this up, it's what we already know. And it's what the Conservatives have been screaming about for the last 10 years. You have 10 years of bad Liberal policies equals failed economic growth, failed economic output, and that put us in this horrendous position on the world economy where we are susceptible to U.S. tariffs and global market pressures. That's where we're at. Meanwhile, if we had been putting in pipelines, if we'd been investing in actual LNG plants, critical minerals, increasing our oil production, increasing our oil distribution capabilities, we would be sitting pretty right now. Especially with all the Iran stuff that has been going on, everyone would be turning to Canada saying, give me oil, give me gas. Oops, we can't do that now because of the Liberal policies over the last 10 years, which Mark Carney, the clip has been played many times in committee, he advised against doing all of this. And now he's trying to stand up and say, we're going to build Canada strong. Really? So you're going to try and admit that the Conservatives were right all along, but claim this was your idea. And even still not getting anything done.
The government says this year's deficit will be $65 billion. Your office says it will be closer to $72 billion. So who should we believe, you or the government?
I would say that our forecast reflects probably an extra at least 2 months worth of information.
Okay, could we say that the government's books are in worse shape than the government is telling Canadians?
I think in the 2 months of difference of when we published our update versus when the government kind of locked down its forecasts, there was more bad news than good.
The report says there's less than 1% chance that the government's deficit to GDP plan unfolds as projected. For the average Canadian watching at home, does that mean that there's a 99% chance the government's plan does not unfold the way they say it will?
I think that that is a fair statement.
Okay.
Unless the government takes action to correct how bumpy the economy can be.
It's Mary Jansen here, everybody. And I like the way she's asking questions here because it's rapid fire. It's bang, 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 bang. And to the PBO's credit, she's answering them as quickly as she's being asked them. So remember what we said before? Government always increases spending. Well, they said it was going to be 68 billion. PBO says it's going to be 72 billion. That's 72 billion that we're borrowing this year. That's what that means. It means the national deficit, national debt, is going to be going up by another $72 billion this year. Yay, Mark Carney.
Would you describe that as a significant fiscal risk?
I would describe that as a risk to the anchor itself. I think that there's probably more margin to manage safely and prudently within that space, but the anchor itself has got some design issues.
And if a business came to a bank with a financial plan that had a 99% chance of failing, they would never get a loan. So with that in mind, should Canadians be concerned about a government's current economic situation?
I think the implication of that work is to say that because the economy remains subject to so many risks, and because the anchor is so sensitive to both the movement in the deficit as well as the GDP, it's going to be a tough target to hit.
Does using overly optimistic growth assumptions make the government's finances appear healthier than they may actually be?
I think time will tell on where it lands. But in a straightforward way, if the assumptions are too high, then the forecasts will be too high.
What are the biggest risks that could cause the Liberal government's fiscal projections to miss their targets?
There's a number of fiscal risks, and I think people are very cognizant of the trade situation, especially with the U.S. The ongoing conflict in the Middle East has implications for oil, for trade, for supply routes, for supply chains, and the global stock markets, I think, are an increasing source of risk. In that, people are very concerned that the valuations we're seeing right now may be overly inflated, and that could be painful to see it unwind.
If you take away Canada's connection to the U.S. market, and basically you take away one of the biggest reasons that companies choose Canada in the first place, would you say that that's a big risk?
I think it's straightforward that Canada is got significant ties to the U.S., and what happens in the U.S. Has always had big implications for Canada.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Carney's hand-picked parliamentary budget officer is in committee saying that the U.S. is a significant part of Canada's economy and is essentially responding to that question by Tamara Jansen of, what happens if the U.S. is severed from us? What happens if, Mark Carney tries to do something else? It creates a big problem. So all of these people out there that are cheering, actively cheering that we're pulling away from the United States, I guarantee that almost none of them know anybody that are in any business with the United States, that are working for any businesses that have this integration with the United States or have any concept of the business integration we have with the United States. Tamara Jansen brings up a very good point here, and she says, listen, one of the reasons why Canada is so attractive is because our proximity to the world's largest economy. So it only makes sense for a business to want to come into Canada if they're going to get good access to the United States. Well, if Canada is now going to be in this position where we're doing everything possible to move away from the United States, why would businesses be interested in coming to Canada from other countries? And the answer is they wouldn't, And the answer is we already see that right now. 5 straight quarters of declining investment from businesses in Canada. We have more businesses being opened in the United States by Canadians than in Canada itself. Canada has made it very difficult for anyone to do business in Canada. Yet Mark Carney will tell everybody that there's all this investment coming. From where, Mr. Carney? Where? And we chatted about this with our interview with Catherine Swift and asked her directly. Mark Carney says that, we have the, second highest foreign investment per capita in the G7, all these qualifiers. What does that even mean? Well, it means that foreign businesses are coming to Canada and buying our businesses, and in some cases, shutting them down. That's not investment, but that's what the government counts as investment. They will cherry pick any data they can to reinforce their narrative. But here's the reality. No matter what they cherry pick and no matter what narrative they put out there, Canadians are feeling it in their bank account, and they're feeling it every time they go to the grocery store, like Mark Carney told them to evaluate them on. So, when Mark Carney's hand-picked budget officer comes into committee and says Mark Carney has a less than 1% chance to actually hit any of the targets that he put out there, is going to spend more than he said he would, and that they're projecting a below potential forecast for GDP, I believe her.